I grew up my entire childhood without a father. When I turned 15, I got really into hunting and just enjoyed guns in general. My uncle is an avid hunter, gun builder, and ammunition reloader. He loves to hunt, and this was a common interest that made us become pretty close. He was my father figure and taught me a lot that made me the man that I am today. But now to the story. My uncle's father lives in Montana, which allowed us to get resident pricing on big game hunting tags. Once a year, we would head up to his property and hunt for a week. Usually, this would go off without a hitch, and if we were lucky, we'd get the shot that we were looking for. Unfortunately, not this year though. Just like every year, we headed up to his father's property in northern Montana. That night, we headed out to go set up some hunting cameras so that we knew that there were deer in the area, and so that we knew it was a good place to hunt. It must have been 1 a.m. and we were driving down this 2-lane dirt road, headed into the woods. We were always the only people on that road since it was so early in the morning. This particular time though, we saw headlights approaching us from behind, but we didn't think too much of it. We figured they must have been doing the same thing as us. After tailing us for some time, the headlights disappeared, which was strange since there were no turns on this particular road. A few seconds go by and all of a sudden, we see the same truck driving on the shoulder to our right with the lights off. The shoulder was a small hill with brush and a fence fairly close to it. Definitely something that nobody should be driving on. The truck speeds up and gets back on the road, turns its lights back on and speeds off into the darkness. This obviously set off some red flags for us, but we figured that they were just impatient and wanted to get there before us. No big deal. Or so we thought. We drove down the road for a few more miles until we saw taillights stopped in the middle of the road. It was the truck that passed us a few miles back. They had set up traffic cones to completely block the road off, and there was another truck parked on the shoulder. We figured they must have broken down or something, so we stopped. I had read an article online earlier this year about people in other countries that would make roadblocks to rob and kill people for their vehicles and belongings. I laughed and started to tell my uncle about this article when 2 men from each truck jumped out of their vehicles and started to approach us. My uncle always kept 2 handguns on shoulder holsters under his arms when we were out doing things of this kind. And this absolutely saved our lives. 2 of the men stayed at the tailgate of the truck parked on the road, and the other 2 men came up to his window. At this point, my uncle had his right hand in his jacket with his hand holding the gun. The men were extremely friendly and said that the truck on the shoulder had broken down, and they were just helping him out. They asked if my uncle knew anything about cars and if he could come and take a look at the problem. My uncle refused though, and this made the men angry. Both instantly drew pistols, and one of the men rounded the front of the truck towards my window. My uncle grabbed the man's gun that was pointed at him, which he forgot to load a round into, luckily for us. And then my uncle pulled his gun out and shot the man in the shoulder and slammed on the gas, driving on the left shoulder, passing all of the men. I looked back and could see the other 3 men gathering around the man my uncle shot. We drove and drove and drove for what seemed like an eternity without saying a word to each other. We drove back to his dad's house and he told me to go to bed. He called the police and told them what had happened, and they sent out 2 officers to the house to take his statement and mentioned to him that they'd actually had quite a few reports of roadblocks being set up all around northern Montana. They were able to catch all 4 of the men who stopped us that night when they took the man who was shot to the hospital. It was last summer, July of 2017, when I decided to take my toddler to the park. It's about 2 miles from my house, on the other end of town. Thinking about it now, the park is an awful location. Secluded on a back road, in the middle of nowhere. But at the time, I thought it would be a good place to allow my daring 2-year-old to roam without having to worry about traffic or anything. I was 5 months pregnant at the time and figured that I could use the exercise too, so I loaded her up in a stroller and walked over. My daughter was, and still is, a huge fan of the whole rock hunting trend. So, upon arrival, I took her out of the stroller, parked her under the pavilion, and hand in hand, we went along to the creek and through the park scavenging for painted rocks. I noticed a glittery rock under the bottom of the slide and pointed it out to my daughter. She ran and scooped it up, yelling and screaming, "I found one, Mummy, I found one." Next, I heard clapping. It was then that I first noticed a man sitting down at a picnic bench near the pavilion. He was eating a sandwich, and he had a smile on his face, which initially seemed friendly, and he was clapping at my daughter's excitement and even let out a woohoo. He looked to be around my age at the time. I'd guess 23. I found out later that he was in his early 30s, though. He was wearing sweatpants and a plain black tank, a beanie on his head, basketball sneakers, and a book bag. Me being from a small town where everyone is genuinely friendly, I thought that maybe he just walked over from the basketball courts down the street and just wanted some shade to eat his lunch under. My little one is so persistent on finding more rocks that I didn't even have time to think before she took my hand and led me over to a small bank down to the duck pond. I didn't realize at the time that my phone, my pepper spray, everything that I had with me was now in a stroller under a pavilion with a total stranger, and my daughter and I were out of sight. After a few minutes of searching the rim of the pond for rocks, we decided it was time to go and play on the playground. As we crossed over the top of the bank, I see this man rummaging through my stroller. I reached to my pocket for my phone so that I could call the town cops, thinking that this was just some thug looking for some spare cash or something, or maybe a purse in my child's stroller. Then I realized that my phone, it was in the stroller. I'm 2 miles from my house. The park is completely surrounded by creeks and ponds, with the entryway being the only way in, and the nearest house is about half a mile past the pavilion. So, even if I wanted to run or to get help, this guy would obviously see me and flee. Now, let me remind you, at this moment, I wasn't thinking the worst. I didn't think about this guy being a potential killer or anything. My main concern was that he was going to steal my belongings. Naive, I know. So, after a couple of minutes of standing there, watching him go through the stroller, he looks up. Our eyes lock and I say, "Excuse me?" He replies, "Oh, I'm sorry. Do you happen to have any aspirin? I'm really not feeling well." I nodded my head no, grabbed the stroller in one hand and my daughter's hand in the other. In hindsight, I should have at this point put my toddler in a stroller, but I didn't because I knew that I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. But this is when things got weird. "Well, do you have any water or maybe a bite to eat? I think my sugar is low," I heard him say in an innocent tone. And my mind started going a million miles a minute at this point. I mean, I literally just watched him eat a sandwich. This was a trap for sure. "Well, aren't you the cutest little thing I've ever seen? What does your shirt say?" he says to my toddler as he lunges out and grabs her shoulder. I grip her hand tight and pull her towards me. "You've got to be kidding me." He read. "How cute. Do you like kittens? I have a couple at my house just down the road." I swooped her up, grabbed the stroller and started walking as fast as I could with a giant baby belly and a squirmy toddler in my arms. I hear him yell, "I wasn't trying to scare you," but I just keep walking. I get to the entrance of the park, turn around, and he's following me. Hot on my trail, he's smiling too. His smile now doesn't seem so kind and innocent either, more malicious and twisted, and he's waving at me, trying to flag me down. I know that at this rate, due to my pregnancy and my toddler kicking and screaming, that he would eventually catch up to me, so I stop, strap my daughter in her stroller, missing 2 buckles, and take off. I'm now trying to figure out how to get my phone. I know that it's in my purse, in the bottom of the stroller, but I can't reach it without stopping and digging it out. Every couple of feet, I would look back to see if this creep was still behind me. Every single time, he was. Until I hit town. I assumed that the increase in traffic must have scared him off, and at this point, I call 911, who puts me through to the state police barracks. I tell them what happened, and they took a report and asked if he was still following me. I said not that I know of, and they said that since I was now within half a mile from my home, that they would just send a trooper to my house whenever they got a chance to finish their report and get a description. But no cop ever came. The next day, I called at 8 a.m, demanding an officer come out. Once again, I was told that they would when they get a chance. So, I took to the almighty Facebook with my story. Not so much for attention, but more to let other parents know to be aware when taking their kids to that park. That night, at 9 p.m, the local news shared my story over Facebook. At 9:10 p.m, my phone rang. It was a local police officer asking me to remove my Facebook post because it was causing an uproar in the community. And boy, I went off. I mean, the man harassed me and my toddler, tried talking my toddler into going to his home, and followed me into town, and they couldn't care any less. Anyway, fast forward 2 weeks, and I was looking at the local news page and came across my story. I see that someone responded to it with a ha-ha emoji reaction. I clicked to see who it was, and I see that his name is, well, let's just say, Tim Smith. I start looking through his photos, trying to put a face to the name, and then I see it. A photo of Tim Smith with the creep from the park. The caption says, "My son and me," and all of the comments asking if he was out of jail yet. I mentioned this to my husband, and he had the brilliant idea to look up the last name Smith on Megan's Law to see if anything would show up. And sure enough, there he was. He did 8 years in jail for touching little kids, and had a couple of other charges on his record too. I called the police and reported that I now know the name of the person and know for a fact that he's a child predator and shouldn't have been that close to a park or school. There's a daycare about a mile away, in fact, which we walked past while he was following me. And again, they dismissed me. Just last month, I made a public Facebook post on the local rock hunting page about how excited I am to start rock hunting again now that the snow has melted. A bunch of people liked the post, but only one person commented. Someone by the name of Ron Smith, who wrote, "I can't wait to see you again." Since then, I've gotten my pistol permit. Due to my engagement ending, I had to move back with my alcoholic dad while I saved up to get my own apartment somewhere. My dad and I had a fight, so I decided to go stay at my friend's house that night because I needed a break from the drunken shenanigans at my house. I've known this friend since middle school, but she's always had a questionable taste in guys. I figured everything was fine though, since she and her boyfriend have an infant son together. Her boyfriend went out that night with his friends, and my friend and I hung out and played with her son and dog until 11 when we decided to go to sleep. She showed me to the guest room and then went to her room to sleep with the baby. At around 2 a.m, her boyfriend comes home with some friends, and I hear them moving around outside my door, and they weren't acting like typical drunk people, so I opened my door a crack and peeped outside, and they were shooting up, and by the looks on their faces, they were pretty tweaked out. My friend's apartment is a 200-year-old house, converted into 2 apartments, So there were no locks on the doors unless you had a skeleton key or something. My friend has insomnia since her baby is pretty colicky and they had just gotten to sleep, so I didn't want to wake her. Plus, I'd have to go past the tweakers to get to her, so no thanks. I decided to just try and sleep and hope they'd leave us be. But about 5 minutes later, my door opens and the light spills in. These two guys are staring at me from the doorway, giggling. "Hey, are you awake, baby girl?" they asked, and I laid still and tried to keep my breathing slow and even so I'd look like I'm asleep. Then, someone says something from a different room, so the tweakers leave my doorway to go talk to whoever said something. I quickly shut the door and got an Uber, and I climbed out the bedroom window, which was luckily broken and quite easy to get out of. Then I went to my friend's bedroom and knocked on her window and told her that I was going and she could come with me with the baby if she wanted to. My friend packed a bag and sent the baby with me, but decided to stay home to make sure that her boyfriend didn't do anything stupid. The next morning, she tells me she had to call the cops on the tweakers' friends because she caught them trying to steal out of her son's piggy bank and they wouldn't leave. I don't know what they were doing at my door that night, but man, it was freaky. Yeah, so, my cousin was actually the one who suffered through this, but I was there for it. We'd been on vacation visiting my cousin's home, and after a festive night of visiting and reconnecting, they sent all the kids upstairs to bed around 10 p.m. We all marched upstairs, and after a few moments, I got scared and went back downstairs where the adults were playing cards and drinking. My mother ordered me to go back upstairs, but first I told her that I was afraid, and my uncle spoke up and said, "What's there to be afraid of, sweetie? Your brothers and sisters are up there, and your cousin's up there too. You're not alone." I said that the room at the end of the hall with the door closed really scared me. My uncle said, "I don't know why. Your older cousin is in there with her baby girl sleeping. If anything happens, she'll hear, or just run to her room, okay?" I agreed and reluctantly marched back upstairs. As I passed the hall to that room, I felt my skin crawl, but I sucked it up and ran into the room I was sleeping in and jumped into bed with my cousin, forcing her to sleep on the outside of the bed and me against the wall. It felt like I had just gotten to sleep when we were awoken by these blood-curdling screams and the hysterical shrill screaming of a baby. We sat up in bed and froze as all of the adults came charging up the stairs with my uncle in the lead carrying a baseball bat and my dad behind him carrying a rifle. The screams didn't lessen any as my uncles pounded on the door to the room my older cousin with a baby was in, and he screamed, "Alyssa, open the door!" Finally, as the screams continued, my uncle and father busted the door down and charged inside. By then, all of us kids were standing in the doorways, fearfully watching. But when the door was busted down, and it literally fell in inward, we could see from the hall lights my cousin holding her baby tight and sitting up in bed screaming as the baby screamed too, but with her chubby little hand pointing at the far wall. Everyone looked at the far wall and there was nothing there but the wall. My uncle rushed in and grabbed the baby and handed her to my aunt, who quickly took her downstairs, and then my cousin was still screaming as if in shock or frozen. My uncle grabbed my cousin out of the bed and carried her in her catatonic state out of the bedroom and down the stairs. And only then did she stop screaming. I was terrified because that room had scared me earlier, and now here was this happening, and no door to boot. So, although my mum tried to calm us down and put us all back to bed, I was not having it and rushed past her downstairs. Like a lead sheep spurring on the flock, suddenly all the kids were rushing down to almost knocking my mum down. When we all got downstairs, we saw that my cousin was laying in her parents' bedroom with a washcloth on her head, and my aunt saying that they'd called an ambulance because she was burning up with a fever, and wouldn't come out of a catatonic state of staring blankly. All of us kids were ordered into the living room to sleep anywhere that we could find a spot, and I saw my dad and uncle carrying a huge piece of plywood upstairs and heard hammering going on. Later, much later, after the ambulance carted my cousin to the hospital and my aunt and uncle followed it, taking the baby to the hospital in their car, we overheard my dad talking to my mother, and this is what he said. Apparently, my cousin has been telling her parents that strange things had been happening in that room, but they wouldn't believe her. So she took to burning candles for nightlights and draping crucifixes all over the doors and windows. My cousin told my aunt that the night before, she had woken up to all the candles being out, the room pitch black and super cold. Through the moonlight shining in her window, she saw a man all in black, standing over a baby in its crib. She screamed and threw a book at him and flipped the light on, only to see that there was nothing there. But still scared, she took her baby into the bed with her for the night, sleeping with the lights on. Fast forward to this night, she had gone to bed early because she had college in the morning, but the baby was so fussy that she had cradled the baby, rocking her while sitting on the bed. Finally, the baby fell asleep and she turned the lights out and laid down too. Sometime in the night though, her room grew icy cold and woke the baby, who started crying. She woke up, and as she was trying to shush the baby back to sleep, the baby starts pointing to the wall behind her mother and starts crying louder. My cousin turns around to see what the baby was pointing at, and was shocked to see this huge man in black standing in the shadows of the corner. He was wearing an old black fedora hat and was looking down when she saw him. She gasps and cradles her baby and crawls to the far corner of her bed and calls for her dad. They can't hear her downstairs, and so she calls out again. That's when the man looks up slowly, like in slow motion with his eyes closed, and now she sees his face, which looks like a gaunt old death mask of a man. She screams a small scream, and then the man opens his eyes, and they're blazing red in color, almost glowing. And he smiles at her and starts to slowly walk towards her. That's when the baby gets hysterical and gives terrified screams, and she screams too as the man with the red eyes gets closer. Just as he's about to touch her, the door busts open and the man disappears, and she goes into shock. Long story short, my cousin came out of it after a few days in the hospital and refused to go back to the house and went to live with a girlfriend in the city with her baby. My uncle and aunt sold the house, but not before sealing the upstairs off and nailing a huge piece of wood soaked in holy water blocking it or something. Apparently, they continued to hear footsteps of a man in boots and poundings and knockings on the wooden door, but whatever it was seemed to stay confined to that upstairs room. At night, they would see the lights turn on and off through the upstairs windows, and one night I actually saw the outline of a man in black standing in the window of my cousin's room upstairs, just looking down at them. It was some really scary stuff. So, I was about 16 at the time, and I'm a male. My family and I went to go visit some relatives that we had in a foreign country. I was born and raised in the US, but we still go back often to visit relatives and whatnot. My dad didn't want to keep paying for a hotel, so a few years back, we bought an apartment. This trip was our first time staying at that apartment. My dad was still back in the US finishing up some business, as he was going to meet us there at a later time. So, it was my mum, my 3 brothers, 1 older, 2 younger, and I. The landlord who gave my mum the key was sort of creepy from her description, but it didn't really alarm anyone that much. Also important to the story is that my mum got the key and met the landlord alone, since we were still taking care of things at my uncle's house. It's now been a few weeks, and my mum, she couldn't stand her room anymore since there was no air conditioning. I didn't blame her, so we just all slept in the living room where the air conditioning was. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until about 4 weeks into staying there. At around 2 a.m, my mum woke me up with her finger over her mouth, basically saying keep quiet. My mum had never done this before, so I shot up and made a hand motion, asking what was going on. She pointed to the door and someone was jiggling the doorknob. We had forgot the lock, but thank God that my older brother got into the habit of chain locks from his college days. It should be noted that my brother was dead asleep in another room, so I was now the oldest male here. My mum was distraught and I was thinking about what to do. I was so thankful that at least the chain lock was there, but I think whoever was on the other side noticed that that was all that was holding him back. I saw a face pressed up against the small gap, and I shit you not, it was the landlord. He finally, after about 10 minutes, gives up. Or so I thought. The next thing I see is a coat hanger trying to open the chain lock. I finally decided to do something, so I got up and body checked the door, slamming it shut. I locked the actual lock and yelled in the foreign tongue what would be equivalent to fuck off. I looked through the peephole and the man seemed surprised to hear a man's voice. I guess he assumed, since my mum was the only one to check in, that she was the only one living there. He scrambled down the stairs, and all said and done, he was gone by 2:30 a.m. I looked out the window across the street at the landlord's house, and he just stared at me and then turned the lights off in his house. When we woke up, I told my brother, and he still credits himself for the chain lock. And to be honest, I do too, but I think I still deserve some credit. Anyway, we called the police, but they said that we really didn't have any evidence and that it was my word against his. My mum wasn't sure that it was the landlord, but I swore that it was him, that I had actually seen him. My dad arrived about 4 days later, and I told him the story, and he met the landlord and agreed that he was really creepy. My dad actually believed me too, and my mum didn't feel safe anymore, so we left that apartment that day after my dad arrived. As we drove away, the creepiest thing was that the landlord gave me a little smirk and wave, like he knew that I knew. So, this happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but a bit of backstory first. I'm a 16-year-old girl, and I'm at my dad's most of the time. I don't have the greatest relationship with my mum. She's not a very kind person to me, or my family for that matter. I mean, she judges me for everything that she can. My weight, my voice, my sexuality, pretty much anything she can find to mock me about, she will. It takes a big toll on my mental health and self-esteem, so this is why I stay at my dad's as much as possible. My dad is pretty laid back, to say the least. He doesn't really care what movies I watch, what music I listen to, or what video games I play. He doesn't care about who I bring home as long as they're good to me, which is a major relief considering that I can get away from my homophobic mum for a few days. He doesn't care if I listen to music or watch shows with swearing because he knows it won't change me at all. In fact, we'll sit at home sometimes and watch the Saw movies just for fun. The point I'm trying to make though is that my dad is pretty chill about most things, which is why I'm with him most of the time. I plan on moving in with him full time when I'm 18 until I go to college, if I decide to. But now to the story. A lot of times when I'm at my dad's house, he'll go to play poker during the evening, and sometimes not even getting home until around 2 or 3 a.m. Most of the time, I don't complain because I can be alone for a little while, which is kind of nice sometimes. This was one of those nights. I usually don't go to bed until around 1 a.m, regardless of whether I have school in the morning or not. This particular night, I was home alone and I decided to take a shower around 11 p.m. and dry my hair and then just jump into bed. This was pretty much my routine for me when my dad wasn't home. I have diagnosed panic disorder and anxiety and am on medication for it. One of my biggest triggers for panic attacks is when the door is unlocked when I'm home alone. It scares me that I might leave the door unlocked and someone will come in and murder me or something, so because of this, I make sure the door is locked multiple times before I get into the shower and leave my dogs in the living room. Now, let me quickly explain how my apartment is laid out too. When you walk through the front door, you actually walk through a hall that leads to the living room. In this hall is a closet and the door to my dad's bedroom. After walking through the hall, you enter the living room. To your right is the kitchen, and straight ahead is another closet. And on the right side of the closet is my bathroom, and on the left side of the closet is my bedroom. In other words, it's a fairly small apartment. Before I got into the shower, I left the kitchen light and lamp in the living room on. 2 lights lit and 3 lights unlit. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I always leave the lights like this when I get into the shower, and it's just kind of a ritual I have. I don't really know how to explain it, other than it bugs me if it's set up a different way, so I set the lights the way I want them and go to take a shower. I close my bathroom door all the way, so my older dog doesn't come into my bathroom and pee like he does when I leave the door open. I actually take fairly long showers too, so usually around 45 minutes to an hour. My younger dog doesn't like people, and we got her from a pet store, so it's understandable that she would be afraid of some people, especially men. I'm not sure what it is about men that she doesn't like, but she refuses to even come up to them or be in the same room as them. The only men that she will let touch her are my dad and my uncle. She doesn't like any strangers in general, but men especially, they seem to tick her off. She also dislikes cats, a lot. We live on the first floor in our apartment building, so there'll be cats walking outside on the edge of the screened-in porch, and she'll bark until she just can't anymore. There is also this cup that someone left on that ledge that she dislikes and barks at constantly when it's there. Anyway, about 20 minutes into the hour-long shower, I hear her start to bark. It's not a bark that she does when she hears someone outside, but more terrified. A threatening bark, which, honestly, I hadn't really heard before. It kind of scared me, but I assumed it was just a cat walking by or a squirrel in a tree outside or something, and I simply brushed it off as my anxiety. But a few minutes later, I noticed that she hadn't stopped barking, and my other dog had begun barking as well. He's not much of a barker, although when someone shows up at the door, he'll let out 3 or 4 quiet, excited barks, but these weren't happy barks. They were also kind of threatening barks. This went on until I got out of the shower about 30 minutes later, but when the water shower stopped, so did the barking. I was confused, but also just blew it off as my anxiety again. I wrapped my hair and my body in a towel and headed towards the door when something caught my eye. The bathroom door was cracked open a little. I froze and kind of panicked, trying to remember if I closed it all the way, which I did, I'm sure. I mean, I specifically remember having closed the door so my older dog didn't pee on the floor. I tried to calm myself down to walk out the door when I got an eerie feeling reaching for the doorknob. We live in a safe neighborhood, and I've never gotten this feeling in my life before, and the only way I can describe it is it was like deja vu and confusion together. I opened the door and walked out into the living room, and something seemed really off, but for a moment, I just couldn't place it. But then, it hit me like a brick. All of the lights that I had left on were off, and all the lights I had left off were now on. 3 lights on, 2 lights off. Completely different than my ritual. This was the point when I realized that something was very wrong, or someone had obviously been in my house. All of the candles in the living room were lit, and the lighters were placed outside on the porch with the door closed. We have always kept the lighters and candles side by side, no matter what. At this point, I was still in a towel and had started crying. I was trying to figure out what to do when I remembered to check the front door. And it was unlocked. At this point, I went into full panic attack and had to sit on the floor for a good 3 or 4 minutes. I texted my dad asking if he had remembered to lock the door on his way out, knowing fully well that I had checked it. I also left everything else out of the text because I didn't want to freak him out. He said that he had locked it, so I said okay and decided to see if the lock was broken. But it wasn't. It was working just fine, which meant that it had definitely been picked. I mean, the only way for someone to get in was with a key, and since the lock wasn't broken, that meant that a key was used or something else. The only people who have keys to our apartment are my dad, me, and my biological mother. My stepmom and stepsisters and my mum were all asleep at home. My stepmom was actually playing poker with my dad that night too, and my stepsisters were almost an hour away at college. Nobody who I knew of who had a key had been there other than me, and I can confirm that for sure. The odd thing though is that none of our stuff was stolen, which confused me. I mean, if someone is to break into a house, why would they just switch the lights on and off, light all the candles and not steal anything? Obviously, I didn't get any sleep that night, and I still haven't told my dad about half the things that happened. I have no idea why my bathroom door was open, or why the lights were switched on, or why the candles were lit. But whoever broke into my home has a key, which means that they can come and go as they please. When I was around 5 years old, I used to visit my grandparents' house a lot. It was a pretty small apartment in the middle of the city. It actually looked like a secure place because it was close to a popular shopping district and it faced a busy road, so it was as close to civilization as you can get. I used to go there almost every weekend to meet them, or watch some television and eat my dinner. My brother and I would sometimes even play tag with each other around the apartment complex downstairs. The apartment had a weird structure to it. All the kitchen windows from the apartment would open to the staircase, so anyone going by the staircase could potentially see inside the apartment kitchen through those windows. It didn't really invite danger since there were grills, but it felt like a bizarre design choice. Anyway, one day we were walking around downstairs looking at some cars. Nothing special, just some 5-year-old shenanigans. We were going back upstairs when suddenly we were called at by some old woman. She lived on the ground floor of the complex and it looked pretty ordinary for an old woman. She called at us from the window. She was cooking something and she offered to give us some food through the window. My brother and I took it without hesitation and proceeded to talk to her. We would do this for what felt like quite a few weekends. We'd knock on her window and she'd give us something to eat and we'd talk. All of our interactions happened through the window and she felt like a great person to talk to. She was quite wrinkly and whenever I saw her, she was always cooking something. I told my father that I met this great person and how she gave us food every time that we passed through the staircase. My father told me that no one lived on the ground floor, that it was an office space for an old dentist who closed in the afternoons. Being 5 years old, I just ignored it, thinking that my father didn't know anything and totally dismissed it. I was sure that an old woman lived there. My brother and I continued to meet her anyway, but this one time, I paid attention to her kitchen and her surroundings. It wasn't a big window, but I could see enough of the kitchen and into the living room. I observed the woman's place, and I could see that, apart from the kitchen lights, that there was nothing else switched on. It was all darkness beyond the kitchen. I thought it was weird because, you would at least keep the living room lights on, right? How else do you get to and from the bedrooms? That unsettled me a little bit as a 5-year-old. Why would anyone want to be in the darkness? Seeing the kitchen as the only lit room was pretty unsettling for me. I went to my parents and told them to meet her, just say hi from the staircase, and I took them to the window, and sure enough, no one was there. I knocked on the window really hard, and no one answered. My father told me to stop, and we left, and the kitchen light wasn't on, and somehow it just felt really unsettling realizing how lifeless the apartment looked. I came back the following weekend and knocked on the window, but she didn't answer. So this time, I went to the door and rang on the doorbell. I could see that the apartment was totally dark. Usually, underneath the door, there's at least a little bit of light that you can see coming out from it, since people usually watch TV or relax at this time of day. I rang the door again, but this time keeping my face stuck to the door to hear if anyone was there. And this time, I heard footsteps from the other side. But they were getting louder and louder, and at one point, it felt like she was right on the other side of the door. But what followed was some of the most deafening of silences that I have ever experienced. I waited and waited, keeping my head stuck to the door to hear anyone. But no one was there at all. But I heard those footsteps so clearly. It felt like she was right on the other side of the door, towering over me, breathing down at me. This time, I knew that something was wrong, though. I was really perturbed at this point. My heart was racing, in fact. I just ran off, with tears in my eyes. I wasn't crying because I was scared, though, but something felt really wrong about the place. I went to my parents and just went on to watch some TV, a lot of TV, just to keep my mind off of it. And I never, ever went near that window again. I would look at it from a distance sometimes, but all I saw was darkness. I was always shaken from that too. It really stuck with me. I don't know if that woman was real or not. I could have swore that she was. And to this day, I remember the warmth of the food that she gave me and my brother. My brother never really talked about it, and he might not even remember it, but he was with me every time that I met her, except for the door incident. So, this was something that happened to me during my early childhood, and it creeps me out to this day, 14 years later. The unmistakable sound of those footsteps in that sort of darkness, and the utter silence that followed is something that's gonna stick with me all my life. It sends chills down my spine just thinking about it, and it made me question reality and even my sanity. But I know that I'm sane because my brother, he was there with me. When I was around 11 years old, I was at my home babysitting my younger cousins while my mum went to the grocery store. We lived in a basement apartment, and the basement had only 2 apartments that were right across from each other. On the side our apartment was on, there was the laundry room. The laundry room was fairly large, and that's where most people who had bikes would chain them. So, I was watching television with my younger cousin when I heard a knock on the door. This was super weird to me already because literally no one ever visited us out of nowhere, and my mother had her own key. I was still super short, so I had to get a small chair to stand on so that I could look through the people. I looked through the people and there was some giant dude that I had never seen before. I remember saying hi and then saying, "Can I help you?" The door was still definitely locked though, and the man proceeds to tell me that his bike was stolen from the laundry room. He didn't continue talking though, so I said, "I'm sorry." He proceeds to repeat himself, but then adds that he knows what his bike smells like. I remember being so confused about this, and I couldn't imagine where he was going with it. So I said, I'm really sorry your bike got stolen." And then he says that because he knows what his bike smells like, that I have to open the door so that he can smell my hands. Smell my fucking hands. I got so freaked out that I almost started crying and kept saying that I was sorry, but I didn't steal his bike. He starts getting super aggressive at this and pounds on the door and says that he needs to smell my hands so that he can make sure that I didn't steal his bike. I then get off the chair and just started screaming "Mum" over and over again as if she was home. This was all for his benefit because I speak a different language and would never call my mother Mum. I did this throughout the apartment as if I was going to get her, and when I checked afterwards, he was gone. I don't know what this weirdo was up to and why he wanted to smell my hands, but the aggression indicated that he was up to no good. So this happened last night, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. I'm an 18-year-old dude who lives at home with his mum, and I know that this sounds lame, but I actually like living with my mum. We don't live in the house that I grew up in, but we're in the same neighborhood as my grandma's house, and only a minute away from all of my aunts and uncles and cousins. It's always been a nice and happy area for me because I grew up around here. To say it plainly, I love this place and I feel totally comfortable almost everywhere in the city. But nothing bad has ever happened to me or any of my family members while we've lived in this town. It's close to the Gulf of Mexico and it's full of chemical plants and thus workers from the chemical plants and their families. Most people just mind their own business and have a lot of respect for hard work and integrity. But there are some crazies, I guess. We just don't see them is all. There was a body I found in a storage unit not too terribly long ago, and it was a woman who was murdered by her husband. A man who used to work at the same power plant that I work at now was arrested for killing a woman with his car and driving away. The point being is that shit goes bad sometimes here, but most of the time it's all okay. And that's why I think that this event is still a little shocking to me. It was a typical Thursday. I woke up at 7, went to work and got off at 4. I went home and did all the normal stuff that I do. I took a shower, played some video games, smoked a little and ate some dinner. Pretty good evening so far, and my mum's friend April came over and stayed for a couple of hours. She lives a block away and walked but didn't want to walk alone in the dark. My mum told me at about 9 p.m. that she was walking April back to her house and that it would only take a second. I said, "Alright, and I'll see you soon," and they left. No more than a minute later, though, I thought that I heard tapping on my window. But it was so light and inconsistent that I still don't know if anyone was actually tapping on it. But I still felt a little paranoid, so I turned on some music to distract myself. I turned it down a minute or two later when I could have sworn that I heard my back door open. It's really loud because of, 1, how old it is, and 2, how we always keep the spare key in the lock, which jangles every time it's opened. I quickly turned my music off and didn't make another noise for a minute, and I didn't hear anything. I know that someone opened it, though. I know that someone was inside of my house. I could feel it, but I didn't hear footsteps or a voice or anything. It was completely silent. I was kind of scared, but I quickly told myself to just grab the knife that I keep in my desk drawer, and I did so and felt a little dumb because I figured I was just being paranoid, but better safe than sorry, I guess. Once again, it was silent for a while, and I thought that if I acted like I had the upper hand over whoever this was, he'd be intimidated or scared, so I stood up and walked out of the bedroom, knife in hand. I don't know why, but I whistled, just one note. I took a few steps forward, and I was about to turn the corner, and the back door would be in view, and I stopped again and whistled once more. Still thinking that I was big and tough, I was about to walk around the corner, and then I heard something that made my hair stand up. I heard someone whistle back to me, clearly coming from my living room. The back door is in the living room. I was terrified and I peered around the corner, but no one was there. And the door was closed, but unlocked. I honestly don't know if I left it unlocked or not. I truly can't remember, but my mum came home a few minutes later and I didn't tell her because, I don't know, it just was weird and didn't make any sense. I honestly don't know what to think or do about this whole thing, but man, it was freaky.